Republican leader referred to the American Rescue Plan, which did not receive a single Republican vote in support. He referred to it as runaway federal spending. What did we buy with the American Rescue Plan? We bought vaccines, and we bought an administration and management of delivering those vaccines to the American people in the midst of a pandemic that was claiming American lives every day. Runaway federal spending. How much stronger would this nation be if we were still in the depths of this pandemic? We're emerging from it, thank God, but it wasn't for lack of effort on our part on this side of the aisle. Yes, we spent the money, we administered the shots, and people across America are now protected from hospitalizations and death because of it. No apologies here to my colleague from Kentucky. It was money well spent, not just for that, and that was the #1 public health purpose, but secondly, to keep businesses afloat so they could reopen their doors as the pandemic ebbed. That investment in the capital of America, in the businesses of America, paid off for business owners who otherwise would have lost their life savings and family investments, and for their workers who finally returned to work. I think of the help to small businesses, and I think to help the families. The child tax credit, which cut in half child poverty in America. That child tax credit, according to the senator from Kentucky, was runaway federal spending. Tell that to the family that lives paycheck to paycheck and tries to provide the basics in life for their children. No apologies here for the American Rescue Plan. And when you ask the American people, what about this inflation? It's a problem. Of course it is. We see it as they do. And we see it all across the world. Inflation isn't confined to the United States. It is reflected in a world that is emerging from COVID-19, where economies, local economies, were strangled and choked and restricted. Now they're expanding. People are expanding their needs and spending on that side of it. The supply doesn't keep up with it, and inflation results. We have a battle ahead of us and many plans here to try to address it with a number of items to reduce the cost of living for families. The second item I would like to mention refers to a moving, historic presentation this morning by the President of Ukraine to a joint session of Congress. He did it virtually by remote because he is literally in Kyiv, risking his life every single day for his nation. Vladimir Zelensky may have started life as a stand-up comedian. At this moment in life, he is a stand-up president of Ukraine who is confronting the monster of Moscow, who's unleashed this invasion on his country. He begged us to continue to help, and we will. Last week, we added almost $14 billion to the effort to support the Ukrainian defense and resistance. We need to do that and more. Many of the suggestions by the Republican senator are consistent with that goal, and I would endorse them. But I want to leave it to President Biden to make the critical decisions as our commander-in-chief, who is really tasked with America's national security as his highest priority. I take exception to this notion that Joe Biden didn't understand the timing of this crisis. He understood it better than anyone. He knew that if he pushed too far and too fast, two things might occur. First, that the Russians would move because we had precipitated it with an action we'd taken. He was hoping, as we all did, that this could be ended bloodlessly and that an innocent people would be saved from what we see, the devastation that is happening in Ukraine today. So he was careful to make those moves in a way that Putin couldn't use them as an excuse for starting the invasion. And second, and more important, he needed to move at a pace consistent with building the NATO alliance. President Joe Biden succeeded in that effort. The NATO alliance today is stronger than it has ever been. Don't believe the last president of the United States had anything to do with that. Just the opposite was true. Joe Biden picked up that alliance from the mat and brought them up to fighting trim to be ready, if needed, to defend every square inch, as he says, of NATO territory. That timing was crucial, and decisions which seemed so easy and obvious in America were much more complex on the continent of Europe. Joe Biden knew that, and he paced himself accordingly. And because of that, today we have the strongest alliance in the face of Vladimir Putin that he has ever seen and that we have ever seen. The last point I want to make to this: You could not watch the graphic video presented by President Zelensky without breaking your heart. Every parent and grandparent in America watching that video saw a member of his family, a child, a lifeless corpse because of madman Vladimir Putin and what he is doing to that poor country. Unprovoked, he has invaded them and kills innocent people every single day. Last night, unanimously, the Senate decided, as they should, that the conduct of Vladimir Putin is nothing short of a war crime. I can't think of any other way to describe it, and certainly never excuse it. Zelensky touched our hearts too. His people are fighting a valiant effort, and the United States and allies and countries that share our values stand behind him and will continue to. Mr. President, I come to the floor this morning to speak to a different issue, which I'd like to be placed in a separate part of the record. Unanimous consent.
Without objection.
I'm honored to join my colleagues, Senators Murkowski and Ernst, and of course my friend and colleague, Senator Feinstein, to celebrate the reauthorization of the Violence Against Women Act, more commonly known as VAWA. Yesterday, President Biden signed it into law. This is a monumental achievement for the survivors of domestic sexual violence and those who stand by them. It's an achievement that wouldn't have been possible without bipartisan cooperation. Literally would not have been possible. I've been proud to work with my three colleagues that I mentioned. With this strengthened version of VAWA, we've helped to ensure that every survivor in America, no matter where they live, will be able to reach for a lifeline in moment of crisis. We've expanded and authorized services for rural survivors, survivors in need of culturally specific services, and LGBTQ survivors. We've reauthorized programs that ensure survivors and their families can access housing, health care, essential support services. We've improved rape prevention and education, as well as services and protections for young survivors. We've enhanced critical protections for Native American women and children who experience violence at the hands of non-Native perpetrators. It doesn't include everything we'd hoped for. That's the nature of legislation and compromise. I wish there had been stronger protections for housing and economic assistance, but we had to find an agreement, and we did. The bill contains several important provisions to help boost enforcement of our gun laws. I wish it would have finally closed the so-called boyfriend loophole, but that was beyond our reach in this effort. The lack of those provisions could not attract enough bipartisan support in the Senate to pass on their own. They'll be saved for another day. For nearly 30 years, VAWA has transformed the way we address domestic and sexual violence in America and saved countless lives. At a moment when nearly 1 in 3 women, 1 in 3, have experienced some form of physical or sexual violence, a crisis that's grown worse during the pandemic, VAWA is going to help save lives. Let me tell you a story. My office received a letter from a woman named Keisha, who works with Connections for Abused Women and Their Children in Chicago. Keisha told me that VAWA provides funding for domestic violence services at Chicago's Haymarket Center, an amazing agency I know full well. She shared the story of Cassandra, who was receiving treatment at the Center for Substance Abuse and disclosed to her counselor that she was the victim of abusive treatment. Her counselor referred her to VAWA, and that programming gave her an opportunity to, quote, open up about the emotional, financial, and physical abuse she'd suffered for years at the hands of an abusive husband. Keisha wrote, after weeks of domestic violence psychoeducation, a supportive network encouraging her, and her own personal resilience, Cassandra decided that if she wanted to remain in recovery and not relapse, she had to find a new home, away from her abuser. With the help of her domestic violence counselor, Cassandra was able to break free and transition into temporary housing. She's been able to gain financial independence and find a job. She's remained on her path to recovery, a success story, and a reminder that VAWA doesn't just help save lives, it gives survivors the power to rebuild their own lives. VAWA also provides funding for educational programming, and it's done it so well. I want to thank Senator Feinstein, Senator Ernst, Senator Murkowski for their partnership and tireless leadership in getting this bill addressed, introduced, and crossed the finish line. I want to thank their staff, Jessica Jensen, Senator Feinstein's chief counsel, as well as Nick Zanikis, her former chief counsel, Corey Becker, Christina Sessick, Senator Ernst, Legislative Director and General Counsel, and Anna Dietrich, Senator Murkowski's Legislative Assistant. On my Judiciary Committee staff, I give thanks especially to Stephanie Trefone, Nicole McLean-Walton, and Chastity Burns. I want to thank the other members of the committee and of jurisdiction and their staff, along with Ranking Member Murkowski and the minority staff on the Indian Affairs Committee chaired by Brian Schatz. They have done an extraordinary good job, bipartisan job when it comes to Native Americans. Chair Murray and the staff of the Health Committee, Chair Brown and the staff of the Banking Committee, Chair Wyden and the staff of the Finance Committee were part of this victory. As you can see, this was a multi-committee team effort on both sides of the aisle, and that's the only reason we can stand here today and say we will continue to give hope to those who are struggling with domestic violence and abuse. I yield the floor. Unanimous consent that Senators Ernst, Murkowski, and Feinstein be permitted to speak for up to 10 minutes each prior to the cloture vote on the Corley nomination.
Without